Sometimes the places we abandon don't abandon us in return. Walter Crane stood at the rusted gate of 1247 Sycamore Ridge, staring at the house that time forgot. 30 years of Northern California fog had transformed his childhood home into something from a fairy tale. Every shingle, every window frame, every inch of the Victorian cottage wrapped in a thick blanket of emerald moss. The stuff grew like velvet over the entire structure, so dense you could barely make out the original architecture beneath. His arthritic fingers trembled as he fumbled with the old key. 3 months ago, he'd been a respected clockmaker with a modest apartment in San Francisco. Then his pension evaporated, his landlord sold the building, and suddenly Walter found himself with nowhere to go but backward. The house had been sitting empty since his parents died, too remote to sell, too painful to visit, until desperation made the choice for him. The moss-covered door creaked open, and Walter stepped inside expecting decay and cobwebs. Instead, he found something impossible, his mother's kitchen exactly as she'd left it, complete with fresh coffee steaming on the stove and the morning light streaming through windows that should have been black with dirt. What kind of moss preserves a house like a time capsule, and what else might it have preserved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Walter's weathered hand reached toward the coffee pot, then stopped inches away. The steam rising from the spout carried the familiar aroma of his mother's morning blend, chicory and dark roast, the same combination she'd brewed every day for 40 years. His rational mind insisted this was impossible. Margaret Crane had been dead for 3 decades, buried next to his father in Hillside Cemetery 15 miles down the mountain. Yet here was her favorite mug sitting beside the stove, the one with the chipped handle and faded roses. Here was the sugar bowl she'd inherited from her own mother, positioned exactly where she always kept it. Even the wooden spoon she used to stir her coffee lay at the precise angle Walter remembered from countless childhood mornings. He pulled his hand back, as if the pot might burn him. The kitchen felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with the supernatural impossibility of fresh coffee. It felt too small, like a dollhouse version of the room where he'd eaten breakfast before school. The cabinets seemed lower, the windows narrower. Had the moss somehow compressed the entire house, shrinking it inward? Walter turned from the stove and surveyed the rest of the kitchen, with the methodical eye of a man who'd spent 50 years examining intricate mechanisms. The refrigerator hummed softly, odd, since the electricity should have been shut off years ago. His mother's ceramic canisters lined the counter in perfect order: flour, sugar, coffee, tea. A dish towel hung from the oven door, still damp as if she'd just finished drying her hands. But it was the bread that made his knees weak. A loaf of his mother's honey wheat bread sat cooling on the cutting board, the crust golden brown and split along the top where the dough had risen beyond the pan's edges. The same bread she'd baked every Tuesday for as long as he could remember. Walter could see the steam still rising from the crack in the crust. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his chair, the one that faced the window overlooking the garden. The wood creaked under his weight, a sound so familiar it bypassed his conscious mind and went straight to his bones. How many mornings had he sat in this exact spot, wolfing down breakfast while his mother fussed over his school clothes and his father read stock reports from the San Francisco Chronicle? The newspaper. Walter's gaze fell on the folded paper beside his father's coffee cup. The Chronicle, dated October 15th, 1994. The day his parents died. His chest tightened. That morning had started like any other. Breakfast in this kitchen, his father grumbling about interest rates, his mother pressing an extra slice of buttered toast on Walter despite his protests about his waistline. He'd been 43 then, already grey at the temples, but still young enough to believe he had endless time to visit more often, to call more frequently, to be a better son. The phone call came 6 hours later. Black ice on Highway 1. The car had slid off the road and tumbled down the cliff face before anyone could react. Walter reached for the newspaper with shaking fingers. The paper felt crisp and new, not brittle with age. The headline read, "Tech stocks continue surge." Below that, a smaller story about a water main break in the Mission District. He remembered this exact edition. His mother had read him the water main story over the phone that morning, worried because his apartment was only a few blocks away. A sound from outside made him look up. Through the kitchen window, he could see the garden his mother had tended with religious devotion. The rose bushes were in full bloom despite the October date, their red and yellow blossoms vibrant against the backdrop of moss-covered fence posts. The vegetable patch showed neat rows of late-season tomatoes and winter squash, exactly as his mother would have planted them. But something else caught his attention. A flash of movement near the old tool shed. Walter squinted, trying to make out what he'd seen. The shed was so thoroughly covered in moss it looked like a green hill, but the door stood slightly ajar. As he watched, the gap widened fractionally, as if someone inside was peering out. His pulse quickened. If someone was living here, a vagrant, a squatter, it might explain the fresh coffee, the working electricity, though it wouldn't explain the newspaper dated 30 years ago, or the bread that looked exactly like his mother's recipe. Walter stood slowly, his arthritic joints protesting the movement. Outside, the October afternoon was growing dim, fog rolling in from the Pacific to wrap around the hills like a familiar blanket. In a few hours it would be dark, and he'd be alone in this impossible place with its perfect preservation of a life that had ended 3 decades ago. He looked once more at the steaming coffee, the warm bread, the newspaper that shouldn't exist. Tomorrow he would have to figure out what was happening here, would have to apply logic and reason to this mystery. Tonight, though, he was an old man who had nowhere else to go. Walter reached for his mother's coffee pot and poured himself a cup. The coffee was perfect, exactly as his mother had made it, with just enough chicory to cut the bitterness without overwhelming the blend. Walter wrapped his arthritic fingers around the familiar mug, letting the warmth seep into his joints. Outside, the fog continued its slow advance through the hills, but inside this impossible kitchen, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: comfort. He'd almost forgotten what a real meal tasted like. For the past 6 weeks, since losing his apartment, Walter had survived on convenience store sandwiches and whatever he could afford from the dollar menu at fast food chains. Before that, when his pension payments had started getting delayed, it had been canned soup heated on a hot plate and day-old bread from the discount rack. The honey wheat loaf sitting before him represented a kind of abundance he could barely remember. Walter cut himself a thick slice, watching the steam escape from the golden crumb. The bread was still warm, impossibly fresh. As he chewed, memories flooded back, not just of his mother's baking, but of the life he'd built and lost piece by piece over the past 5 years. It had started with the arthritis. The first symptoms were subtle: a stiffness in his fingers after long days at the workbench, an occasional tremor when handling delicate clock mechanisms. Walter had dismissed it as age, nothing more than the natural consequence of 50 years spent manipulating tiny gears and springs. By the time the diagnosis came, the damage was irreversible. Crane and Sons' fine timepieces had been his pride, a one-man operation housed in a narrow storefront in North Beach. 3 generations of San Francisco families had brought their heirloom clocks to Walter, trusting him with mechanisms that hadn't been manufactured in decades. He could disassemble a 19th-century carriage clock blindfolded, could hear the specific whisper of a mainspring wound too tight from across the room. The irony wasn't lost on him that time itself had been his enemy. Each month brought another cancelled repair, another regular customer who couldn't wait for Walter's hands to cooperate. Mrs. Chen had been his last loyal patron, bringing in her grandmother's mantel clock every 6 months for cleaning whether it needed it or not. When even she stopped coming, Walter knew it was over. He'd closed the shop on a Tuesday in March, selling his tools to a dealer in Oakland for a fraction of their worth. The landlord had been sympathetic but firm. 3 months of back rent was 3 months too many. Walter had packed his remaining possessions into his 15-year-old Honda and moved to a studio apartment in the Tenderloin, the only place he could afford on his reduced pension. Even that hadn't lasted. The pension fund's bankruptcy had made headlines for exactly 1 day before disappearing beneath newer scandals. Walter's monthly check, already modest, had been cut to a quarter of its original amount. The studio apartment's rent ate up 90% of what remained. The eviction notice had arrived on a Monday. Walter remembered standing in the narrow hallway outside his door, holding the legal document and calculating figures that would never add up in his favor. 43 years of paying into the system, 30 years of steady work, a lifetime of modest savings, all of it gone. At 73, he was too old to rebuild and too poor to survive where he was. The bread turned to ash in his mouth as he remembered his last conversation with his nephew David, his only remaining family. They'd met for coffee at a chain restaurant near David's office in Walnut Creek, surrounded by the ambient noise of business lunches and casual meetings. "I wish I could help, Uncle Walt, I really do," David had said, not meeting Walter's eyes. "But with Sarah's medical bills and the kids starting college, we're stretched pretty thin ourselves." He'd slid a $50 bill across the table like an apology made tangible. "Maybe check into those senior housing programs? I heard there are waiting lists, but—" Walter had taken the money because pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The waiting lists David mentioned had hundreds of names ahead of his. The county shelter had a bed for 3 nights maximum. Beyond that lay the streets, shopping carts, and the particular invisibility that came with being old and poor in a city that worshipped youth and wealth. He'd thought of this house then, remembered through a haze of desperation and grief that his parents' property still existed somewhere in the hills north of the city. The deed was buried in a box of papers he'd been carrying from apartment to apartment for 30 years, never quite ready to deal with the memories or the expense of maintaining a place he'd never planned to see again. The coffee had grown lukewarm while he'd been lost in remembrance. Walter stood and refilled his cup, his movements automatic in this kitchen where he'd learned the rhythms of morning and evening, the small rituals that made a house a home. Outside, the fog had thickened, transforming the familiar landscape into something dreamlike and strange. Soon it would be dark, and he would have to decide where to sleep in this house that shouldn't exist, surrounded by the preserved remnants of a life that had ended 3 decades ago. But for now, he had coffee and bread and warmth. For now, that was enough. The warmth of the coffee had barely settled in Walter's chest when the first sound reached him, a soft, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from somewhere deeper in the house. He froze, the mug halfway to his lips, straining to identify what he was hearing. It wasn't random noise, not the settling of old wood or the skittering of mice. This was deliberate, measured, almost musical. Tick, tick, tick. Walter's blood turned cold. He knew that sound intimately, had lived with variations of it for 50 years. It was the steady heartbeat of a pendulum clock, the kind of precise mechanism that required daily winding and careful maintenance. But that was impossible. His parents had owned only a simple kitchen clock, a battery-operated thing that had stopped working years before their death. The ticking grew louder, or perhaps closer. Walter set down his mug with trembling hands and followed the sound through the doorway that led to the front parlor. The room beyond was draped in shadows, late afternoon light filtering weakly through moss-covered windows. But even in the dimness, he could see that something fundamental had changed. The parlor was larger than it should have been, stretched wider and deeper than the cramped space he remembered from childhood visits. Against the far wall stood a grandfather clock that had never existed in this house, a magnificent piece of craftsmanship with an ornate walnut case and brass fittings that gleamed despite the poor light. Its pendulum swung with hypnotic precision, marking time that seemed to move differently here, more slowly, more deliberately. Walter approached the clock with the reverence of a man encountering a masterpiece. As he drew closer, his trained eye began cataloguing details that made his breath catch. The casework was flawless, joined with the kind of dovetails that spoke of true artistry. The dial was hand-painted porcelain, the numbers formed with delicate brushstrokes. Most remarkable of all, the movement visible through the glass panel was a design he recognized, because he had dreamed of building it himself. This was the clock he had planned to make for his retirement project, the masterpiece that would have crowned his career. He'd sketched the design countless times, had even special ordered some of the components before his arthritis made such ambitious work impossible. Yet here it stood, completed to his exact specifications, running with the smooth precision he had imagined but never achieved. A manila folder lay on the small table beside the clock. Walter's name was written across the tab in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of creating it. Inside, he found blueprints, technical drawings, and correspondence with parts suppliers, all bearing dates from the past 5 years, all documenting the creation of the clock that stood before him. According to these papers, he had never developed arthritis. According to this evidence, he had continued working, had built the timepiece of his dreams, had never lost his shop or his livelihood. The ticking seemed to grow louder still, and Walter realized it wasn't coming from just one clock. Other sounds were emerging from different parts of the house, the gentle chime of a mantel clock, the rapid tick of a carriage clock, the deep bong of a wall-mounted timepiece. It was as if an entire workshop of completed projects surrounded him, all marking their own version of time. Walter backed away from the grandfather clock, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just preservation of the past. This was something else entirely, something that suggested possibilities rather than memories. The newspaper in the kitchen had shown the day his parents died, the end of one chapter of his life, but this room seemed to be showing him a different story, one where he had never lost his ability to work, where his dreams had been realized instead of abandoned. A new sound reached him from upstairs. Footsteps, soft but unmistakably real. Walter's throat went dry. Someone was moving around on the second floor, walking with a purposeful gait that suggested familiarity with the house's layout. The steps paused directly above him, then began moving toward what Walter remembered as the staircase. He faced a choice that crystallized with sudden, terrible clarity. He could leave now, walk out the front door and return to the harsh reality of homelessness and poverty that waited beyond the moss-covered threshold. Or he could stay and discover what other impossibilities this house contained, what other versions of his life might be waiting in rooms that shouldn't exist. The footsteps on the stairs grew closer, a slow descent that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Walter looked once more at the grandfather clock, its pendulum marking time that moved in directions other than forward. In its brass face, he caught his reflection, not the broken old man he'd become, but someone who looked rested, purposeful, whole. The choice was no longer about shelter from the cold October night. It was about which version of Walter Crane would face whatever was coming down those stairs. Walter pressed himself against the parlor wall, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. He could hear them distinctly now, the soft pad of house slippers against hardwood flooring. They paused at what he knew was the entrance to the hallway, and in that terrible silence, Walter's mind raced through possibilities that each seemed more impossible than the last. His parents were dead. He had attended their funeral, had stood in the rain beside their graves as the priest spoke words about eternal rest. He had cleaned out this house himself 30 years ago, boxing up their belongings with mechanical efficiency, while grief sat like a stone in his chest. Whatever was walking through these rooms wearing familiar footsteps wasn't them, couldn't be them. But what if it was? The thought sent ice water through his veins. What if this house, with its preserved bread and impossible clocks, had somehow kept more than just objects frozen in time? What if the moss that covered every surface outside had grown inward, preserving not just the physical remnants of life but life itself? Walter's rational mind recoiled from the possibility. He was a man of gears and springs, of mechanisms that could be understood and repaired. The supernatural belonged to books and movies, not to his orderly world of cause and effect. Yet here he stood in a room that had expanded beyond its original dimensions, surrounded by clocks he had never built, but somehow recognized as his own work. The footsteps resumed their approach, moving through the hallway with the confidence of someone who belonged here. Walter found himself trapped between the desire to flee and a terrible, hungry curiosity about what he might see. If it was his mother, if, by some cosmic impossibility, she was still here, still real, wouldn't walking away be the cruelest abandonment imaginable? But if it wasn't her, if it was something else wearing her form like a costume, then staying could mean something far worse than homelessness. Walter had read enough stories to know that houses like this one, houses that offered impossible gifts, always demanded payment in return. What would it cost him to remain in this place where his failures had been erased and his dreams made manifest? The footsteps stopped just outside the parlor entrance. Walter held his breath, pressing deeper into the shadows beside a bookshelf that hadn't existed in his childhood. The grandfather clock continued its measured ticking, each second stretching like taffy in the charged air. Somewhere upstairs, another clock chimed the quarter hour, its notes hanging in the silence like a question waiting to be answered. A shadow fell across the doorway, slight, familiar, wearing the outline of a woman in a house dress. Walter's eyes filled with involuntary tears. Even in silhouette he would know that profile anywhere. The way she held her head slightly tilted when listening, the particular curve of her shoulders that spoke of decades spent bending over kitchen counters and garden beds. "Walter." The voice was exactly as he remembered, gentle, concerned, tinged with the accent she'd never quite lost, despite 50 years in California. "Walter, sweetheart, is that you?" He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his knuckles against his mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. This was wrong. This was impossible. His mother was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery beneath a granite headstone he visited every Christmas. She was not standing in this doorway calling his name in a voice that sounded exactly like love made audible. "I heard you come in," the voice continued. "I've been waiting such a long time. I kept your dinner warm, pot roast, just like you always liked. Your father's in his study working on the books. He'll want to see you." Walter opened his eyes and saw her fully now, standing in the doorway with flour still dusting her apron, looking exactly as she had on the morning she died. Not a day older, not a trace of the cancer that should have taken her 5 years later if the accident hadn't happened first. She was perfect, preserved, impossible. She was everything he had lost and everything he could never have again. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings about traps and illusions, about the price of accepting gifts that violated the fundamental laws of existence. But that voice was growing fainter, drowned out by the overwhelming longing to step forward, to accept her offered embrace, to pretend that the past 30 years of loss and failure had been the real dream. Behind him, the grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its bronze notes seeming to mark more than just the passage of time. Outside, full darkness was falling, and with it came the absolute certainty that whatever choice he made in the next few moments would determine not just where he spent the night, but who he would become. Walter stood frozen between possibilities, between the mother who couldn't exist and the streets that definitely did, while the moss-covered house held its breath around him. Walter's legs moved before his mind could stop them. 3 decades of grief collapsed in an instant as he stumbled forward, his arthritic joints forgotten, his careful skepticism crumbling like old mortar. The woman in the doorway, his mother, impossible as it was, opened her arms with the same welcoming gesture he had dreamed of 1,000 times in the years since her death. "Oh, my boy," she whispered as he fell into her embrace, and she was real, warm and solid and smelling of vanilla and lavender soap exactly as she had when he was young. Her hands patted his back with familiar rhythm, the same comforting motion that had soothed his childhood fears. "I knew you'd come home eventually. I kept telling your father, Walter will come back when he's ready. He just needs time." The rational voice in Walter's head screamed its final warnings, and then fell silent, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of denying what his senses told him was true. His mother was here, alive, exactly as she had been on that terrible morning 30 years ago when a drunk driver had stolen her from the world. Whatever force governed this moss-covered sanctuary had given her back to him, and he found he no longer cared about the price. "Come," she said, taking his hand in hers, those dear, familiar hands that had bandaged his scrapes and taught him to tie his shoes. "Your dinner's getting cold and you look half-starved. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" She led him through the house, past rooms that seemed to shift and expand in his peripheral vision. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, accommodating doorways that opened onto spaces he didn't remember but somehow recognized. A library lined with books he'd always meant to read. A sitting room with 2 chairs positioned perfectly for conversation. A sun porch where morning light would stream through windows that faced a garden he could almost see. The dining room table was set for 3, with his mother's best china and crystal glasses that caught the lamplight like captured stars. Steam rose from serving dishes that held pot roast and mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, fresh rolls that matched the bread he'd found in the kitchen. It was a feast from memory, every dish prepared exactly as he remembered loving it as a child. "Sit, sit," his mother fussed, pulling out his chair with the same bustling energy that had animated her life. "Arthur!" she called toward a room Walter couldn't quite see. "Arthur, come quickly, Walter's here!" Footsteps approached, heavier than his mother's, with the measured gait of a man who had worked with his hands his entire life. Walter's father appeared in the doorway, and the last threads connecting Walter to his skeptical, rational self snapped completely. Here was the man who had taught him to use tools, who had shown him how to see the hidden mechanisms that made things work. He wore his favorite cardigan, the brown one with leather patches at the elbows, and his face lit up with the kind of joy Walter hadn't seen directed at him in decades. "There he is," his father boomed, crossing the room in 3 quick strides. His embrace was fierce, encompassing, redolent with the sense of pipe tobacco and machine oil that Walter associated with safety and belonging. "We've been waiting for you, son. Your mother's been cooking for 3 every night for—" "Well, how long has it been, Martha?" "Time moves differently here," his mother said, settling into her own chair with practiced grace. "What matters is that we're together now." Walter sank into his childhood place at the table between his parents as he had sat thousands of times before. The chair fit him perfectly, neither too large nor too small, as if it had been waiting patiently for his return. His mother began filling his plate with food that tasted exactly as his memory insisted it should, rich, comforting, prepared with the kind of love that had no substitute. "Tell us everything," his father said, leaning forward with genuine interest. "What have you been doing with yourself?" "Still working with clocks?" The question should have brought back all the pain of his lost career, his failed body, his poverty and isolation. Instead, Walter found himself talking about the grandfather clock in the parlor, describing its mechanisms with enthusiasm he hadn't felt in years. His father nodded appreciatively, asking technical questions that showed he understood not just the craft, but the passion behind it. Outside, the October wind rattled windows that no longer seemed moss-covered. The house felt solid around them, permanent, as real as anything Walter had ever known. His old life, the arthritis, the eviction, the cold streets waiting beyond these walls, began to feel like a nightmare he was finally waking from. As his mother refilled his plate, and his father launched into a story about a clock mechanism he'd been puzzling over, Walter felt something inside his chest unlock for the first time in years. Whatever this place was, whatever it cost him, he was home. He was finally impossibly home. The warmth that had filled Walter's chest began to cool as the evening progressed, replaced by something that felt oddly like stage fright. The conversation around the dinner table had taken on a peculiar quality, too perfect, too precisely what he needed to hear. When his mother asked about his work, she seemed genuinely fascinated by his stories of failed commissions and difficult customers, nodding with sympathy that felt rehearsed. When his father discussed clock mechanisms, his technical knowledge was flawless but somehow hollow, like facts recited from a manual rather than lived experience. "You look tired, sweetheart," his mother said, beginning to clear the dishes. "Why don't you go up to your old room? I made the bed fresh this morning." Walter nodded, but as he pushed back from the table, he noticed something that made his stomach clench. The food on his plate hadn't diminished despite his eating. Each bite he'd taken had somehow been replaced, maintaining the same portions his mother had originally served. The bread roll sat exactly as she'd placed it, showing no sign of the butter he distinctly remembered spreading across its surface. "I'll just wash these dishes and then we can sit by the fire," his mother continued, stacking plates with mechanical precision. Maybe you can tell us about those clocks you've been building. The ones in the parlor are magnificent, though I suppose you know that already." Casual mention stopped Walter cold. He hadn't told them about the clocks in the parlor. In fact, he was certain he'd made no mention of having built multiple timepieces. Yet his mother spoke as if this knowledge was perfectly natural, as obvious as remarking on the weather. "What clocks?" he asked carefully. His mother paused, her hands stilling on the dinner plates. For just a moment, her face went completely blank, as if someone had turned off a switch behind her eyes. Then the warmth returned. But it felt forced now, painted on. "Why, all of them, dear. The ones you've been working on. They're beautiful. You should be proud." But Walter could see something else now, something he'd been too desperate to notice before. When his mother moved, she cast no shadow on the wall behind her. The lamplight seemed to pass through her rather than being blocked by her form, and her breathing, he realized with growing horror that her chest never rose or fell, that she spoke without the subtle rhythm of air moving in and out of lungs. "I think I will go upstairs," Walter said, his voice carefully neutral. He needed space to think, to process what he was seeing without those loving, impossible faces watching his every reaction. His father looked up from his pipe, which Walter now noticed produced smoke that never seemed to dissipate or thicken. "Of course, son. Sweet dreams. We'll be right here when you wake up." The promise sounded more like a threat than comfort. Walter climbed the stairs on trembling legs, each step taking him farther from the warm illusion below, and closer to some kind of truth he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The upstairs hallway stretched before him, lined with doors that definitely hadn't existed in his childhood home. Some stood ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms that belonged to lives he'd never lived. A nursery with a crib that had never held his children, an artist's studio where paintings bore his signature despite his complete lack of artistic ability, a library filled with books whose spines carried his name as author. His actual childhood bedroom waited at the end of the hall, its door painted the same blue he remembered from 40 years ago. But when he pushed it open, the room beyond bore only superficial resemblance to the space he'd once occupied. The bed was larger, positioned to catch morning light that would stream through windows facing east instead of north. The desk held notebooks filled with handwriting that looked like his but described experiences he'd never had. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph of a woman he didn't recognize, though something about her smile tugged at memories that felt more like wishes than reality. Walter sank onto the bed and tried to make sense of what was happening to him. The house wasn't just preserving the past, it was offering alternatives to it, showing him rooms full of paths not taken and dreams never realized. Each space presented a different version of his life, a road that branched off from choices he'd made or opportunities he'd missed. Below, he could hear his parents moving through their nighttime routine, his father banking the fire, his mother checking door locks that would never keep out whatever had already invaded this place. Their voices carried up through the floorboards, warm and familiar, and utterly, terrifyingly wrong. Whatever force animated this house was learning from him, reading his memories and desires and reflecting them back in increasingly sophisticated ways. But the performance wasn't perfect. The shadows fell wrong, the physics didn't quite work, and underneath the love and comfort he so desperately craved, Walter could sense something vast and hungry, waiting to see what choice he would make. Outside his window, the moss continued its slow conquest of the world beyond these walls, patient and inexorable as time itself. Walter lay on the too familiar bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows moved in patterns that defied the room's single lamp. Sleep felt impossible, not just because of his racing thoughts, but because something fundamental about this place resisted the natural rhythm of rest. The house hummed with an energy that seemed to feed on consciousness, growing stronger the more aware he became of its contradictions. The photograph on the nightstand drew his attention again. The woman's face seemed to shift slightly each time he looked away and back, her smile becoming more knowing, more specific to desires he'd buried decades ago. In the image, she wore a wedding dress, and beside her stood a younger version of himself, confident, successful, unmarked by the failures that had defined his real life. It was a future that had never existed, polished and perfected like the brass mechanisms of the impossible clocks downstairs. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Walter?" His mother's voice carried through the door. "May I come in, sweetheart?" Before he could answer, the door opened with a whisper of hinges that made no sound. His mother entered carrying a tea service on a silver tray he'd never seen before. Her movements fluid and graceful in a way that memory insisted was exactly right, but observation suggested was too choreographed, too deliberate. "I thought you might like some chamomile before bed," she said, setting the tray on the desk with practiced efficiency. "You always had trouble sleeping when you were worried about something." Walter watched her pour the tea, noting how the steam rose in perfect spirals, how the liquid fell in an unbroken arc that seemed to defy normal physics. The cup she handed him was warm but not hot, exactly the temperature he would have preferred without her having any way to know that preference. "Mother," he said carefully, "how long have you been here? In this house?" Her hands paused over the teapot. For a moment, that blank expression flickered across her features again, the look of someone searching for a script they'd momentarily misplaced. When focus returned to her eyes, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Time isn't what it was, Walter. We measure it differently now." She sat on the edge of the bed, close enough that he should have felt her weight depress the mattress. The bedding remained perfectly level. "What matters is that we have all the time we need now, all the time we were supposed to have. But you died." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. "Both of you. I was at the funeral. I threw dirt on your coffins." His mother's face crumpled with a sorrow that looked genuine but felt performed. "Oh, my dear boy. Is that what you've been carrying all these years? The guilt of surviving?" She reached out to touch his cheek, her fingers ice cold despite the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. "We never left, Walter. We've been waiting here, keeping your home ready for when you needed it most." The tea trembled in Walter's hands. "This isn't real. Houses don't work this way. Dead people don't—" "Drink your tea," she interrupted gently. But something in her voice had changed. The suggestion carried weight beyond mere words, pressing against his thoughts like a physical force. "It will help you understand." Walter found himself raising the cup despite every instinct screaming warnings. The liquid touched his lips, warm, soothing, tasting exactly like the chamomile tea his mother had made during his childhood illnesses. But underneath the familiar comfort, he detected something else. Something that made his vision blur at the edges, and his thoughts slow like clockwork running down. "What did you put in this?" he asked, but his words sounded distant, muffled. "Just what you need," his mother replied, her voice now coming from very far away. "Rest, Walter. Stop fighting what's being offered to you. You've suffered enough in that cold world outside. Stay here where you're loved. Stay where you belong." The room began to shift around him, walls expanding and contracting like breathing lungs. The photograph on the nightstand grew larger, more detailed, until he could see himself living within its frame. Walking through gardens that had never existed, embracing children who had never been born, growing old alongside a woman whose love had never been real. It was seductive, this vision of a life without failure or loss. But through the growing haze of whatever drug coursed through his system, Walter retained enough clarity to understand what was happening. The house wasn't just offering him comfort, it was preparing to absorb him completely, to add his consciousness to whatever collection of preserved moments it maintained. Tomorrow, if anyone came looking, they would find only another room filled with the echoes of a life that might have been. His mother leaned closer, her cold fingers stroking his forehead. "Sleep now, sweetheart. When you wake up, everything will be perfect. Everything will be exactly as it should have been." Walter's last conscious thought, before the drugged darkness claimed him, was the terrible realization that he wanted nothing more than to surrender to that promise, even knowing what it would cost him. The ordeal begins. Walter's consciousness returned in fragments. First, the taste of chamomile and bitter herbs coating his tongue, then the sensation of cold air moving across his skin, finally the realization that he was no longer in his childhood bedroom. He lay on bare earth, surrounded by walls that pulsed with a green, organic luminescence. The moss had him. He was inside the house's true heart, a space that existed between the foundation stones and the carefully crafted illusions above. Here, the emerald growth that covered the exterior had created a vast living chamber where tendrils thick as his arms snaked across the ground and climbed toward a ceiling lost in verdant darkness. The air thrummed with a subsonic vibration that seemed to emanate from the moss itself, a sound like distant machinery or a massive heartbeat. Walter struggled to sit up, his limbs heavy with whatever his mother had given him. The movement sent sharp pains through his arthritic joints, the first genuine physical sensation he'd experienced since entering the house. Here, beneath the illusions, his age and infirmity returned with cruel clarity. As his eyes adjusted to the strange phosphorescent light, he began to make out shapes within the moss-covered walls. Human forms, dozens of them, suspended in cocoons of living green. Some were recent additions, their features still clearly visible through translucent membranes. Others had been absorbed so completely that only vague outlines remained, suggestions of people who had once been but were now part of something larger. Beautiful, isn't it? Walter spun toward the voice, his neck protesting the sudden movement. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, gaunt, wearing clothes that might have been fashionable decades ago. The man's face was pale as parchment, his eyes the same luminous green as the moss that covered everything. "Who are you?" Walter's voice came out as a croak. "I was Thomas Whitmore once upon a time. Came here in 1987 when my wife died and I had nowhere else to go." The man gestured to the cocoons surrounding them. "Found this place just like you did, empty, abandoned, calling to me. The house gave me everything I wanted, showed me a life where Sarah never got sick, where we had children, where I wasn't alone." Thomas moved closer, his footsteps making no sound on the moss-covered ground. "But I fought it, just like you're fighting it now. Thought I knew better than the house did what was real, what mattered. So it brought me here, to the source, to help me understand." "Understand what?" Walter tried to stand, but his legs refused to support him. The drug still coursed through his system, keeping him weak and compliant. "That reality is overrated. That consciousness is just energy, and energy can be shaped, directed, preserved." Thomas knelt beside him, his green eyes reflecting depths that no human gaze should contain. "The house doesn't kill us, Walter. It perfects us, gives us everything we ever wanted, and keeps us in that moment forever." Walter looked again at the cocoons, noticing now how some of them pulsed gently, as if their occupants were dreaming. "They're still alive. Alive, happy, complete. Living their perfect lives over and over again, never aging, never suffering, never losing the people they love." Thomas's smile was gentle, almost paternal. "The house has been doing this for over a century. Every lost soul who finds their way here becomes part of something magnificent." The moss beneath Walter began to shift, sending up tendrils that brushed against his arms with an almost tender touch. Where they made contact, his skin tingled, and for a moment the arthritis pain faded completely. The sensation was seductive, not just the physical relief, but the promise of an end to all discomfort, all uncertainty. "It wants to give you the wife you never had," Thomas continued, his voice hypnotic. "The children who would have loved you, the career that would have brought you satisfaction instead of failure. All of it real to you, all of it perfect, all of it eternal." Walter felt his resistance wavering. The moss crept higher on his arms, and with each inch it covered, his pain diminished. Above them he could sense the house's illusions continuing, his parents maintaining their loving vigil, dinner waiting on the table, warm rooms full of lives he'd never lived but desperately wanted. "What about choice?" he whispered. "What about free will?" Thomas laughed softly. "What good is free will when every choice you've ever made led to loneliness and poverty? When your body betrays you and the world discards you like a broken clock that can't be repaired?" The moss reached Walter's shoulders now, and he could feel his thoughts beginning to slow, his fears dissolving into a warm green peace. In minutes, maybe less, he would join the others in their eternal dreams. He would have everything he'd ever wanted, forever. But somewhere in his failing consciousness, a memory surfaced. Not of his parents or his lost opportunities, but of standing in his empty apartment, looking at his few possessions and feeling something that wasn't quite despair. It had been grief, yes, but also a strange kind of freedom, the weight of a real life, with all its failures and limitations, but unmistakably his own. The moss paused at his neck, waiting for his final surrender. Walter closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him completely. That moment in his empty apartment when the eviction notice had felt less like an ending and more like a strange liberation. He had chosen to come here. Not the house's manipulation, not fate's cruel hand, but his own decision to face whatever remained of his life with dignity intact. "No," he whispered. The word came out stronger than he'd expected, and the moss recoiled slightly, its tendrils loosening their grip on his shoulders. Thomas's green eyes flashed with something that might have been surprise or annoyance. "Walter, don't be foolish. You have nothing to return to. Nothing but pain and poverty and the slow dissolution of everything that made you who you are. I made those choices." Walter struggled against the moss's embrace, feeling it tighten in response to his resistance. They were mine to make, and they were real. He thought of the young apprentice who had marveled at his first successful gear train, the satisfaction of solving mechanical puzzles that had stumped other craftsmen, the quiet pride he'd taken in work done well, even if it hadn't brought fame or fortune. Those moments belonged to him, imperfect, insufficient, but genuine in ways these moss dreams could never be. The house above them shuddered, and Walter felt its attention focus on him like a physical weight. The illusions were dissolving. He could sense his parents' forms wavering, their loving words becoming hollow echoes. The perfect rooms were collapsing back into emptiness, leaving only the truth of abandonment and decay. "You're destroying it," Thomas said, his voice carrying a note of genuine anguish. "The house needs to feed, Walter. It needs our dreams to sustain itself, and all of us. Without new consciousness to nourish it, it dies," Walter finished. "Good." The moss around his neck constricted suddenly, cutting off his air supply. Walter clawed at the green tendrils, his arthritic fingers barely able to grip their slippery surface. Thomas watched impassively as Walter struggled, his pale face showing something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, "but I won't let you condemn the rest of us to dissolution. We've earned our peace." Black spots danced across Walter's vision as the moss tightened its grip. He could feel his strength ebbing, his defiance crumbling under the simple biological need for oxygen. Around them, the cocoons pulsed faster, their occupants somehow sensing the threat to their perfect dreams. Through his fading consciousness, Walter heard something that made his heart sink. Footsteps on the floor above, moving with mechanical precision. His mother's voice drifted down through the moss-covered ceiling, calling his name with renewed urgency. The house was rebuilding its illusions, adapting to his resistance by making them more compelling, more desperate. "Walter, sweetheart, where are you?" The voice cracked with what sounded like genuine fear. "Please come back to us. We love you so much." Even knowing it was false, even understanding what acceptance would cost him, Walter felt his resolve wavering. The voice carried 40 years of accumulated longing. Every Mother's Day when he'd wanted to call but had no number to dial. Every holiday spent alone while imagining family gatherings that would never happen. The moss sensed his weakening resistance and loosened its grip just enough to let him breathe. Thomas leaned closer, his expression shifting to something like compassion. "You see, the house knows exactly what you need. Stop fighting it, Walter. Let yourself have this one perfect thing." Walter gasped for air, his vision clearing slowly. Above them, he could hear his father's voice joining the search, both parents calling for their lost son with mounting desperation. The sound was devastating in its artificial sincerity, a masterpiece of manipulation crafted from his deepest vulnerabilities. "They're waiting for you," Thomas whispered. "They've been waiting for 30 years. Don't you think you owe them this reunion? Don't you think you deserve to feel loved?" The moss began to climb again, more gently this time, offering comfort rather than force. Where it touched his skin, Walter felt years of loneliness and disappointment beginning to fade. The house was showing him mercy, giving him one last chance to choose paradise over the harsh reality that waited beyond its walls. But as the green tendrils reached his throat again, Walter made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden beneath the moss, pressed against the earth where Thomas couldn't see it, his fingers found something hard and familiar, gears and springs, the scattered remains of a clock mechanism, one of the timepieces from upstairs, somehow transported down here where illusions couldn't reach. The brass was tarnished, the mechanism broken beyond repair, but it was real in a way nothing else in this place had been. Walter closed his fingers around a small gear wheel and felt its edges cut into his palm. Sharp, immediate, undeniably true. The house screamed. Walter had found its weakness, the one thing its perfect illusions couldn't replicate. The weight of authentic failure, the beauty of something broken but genuine. The moss recoiled as if burned, and in that moment of freedom, Walter understood with terrible clarity that he was about to lose everything the house had offered him, forever. The house's scream wasn't a sound, but a vibration that shook Walter's bones. A psychic shriek of rage and betrayal that made the moss-covered walls pulse like wounded flesh. Around him, the cocoons began to writhe as their occupants stirred from their perfect dreams, faces contorting behind translucent membranes as reality bled through their manufactured bliss. Thomas staggered backward, his green eyes wide with horror. "What have you done?" he gasped, but his voice was changing, becoming hollow and distant. The vitality was draining from his features, revealing the truth beneath the house's preservation. A man who had died decades ago, sustained only by borrowed consciousness and artificial purpose. Walter clutched the broken gear wheel tighter, feeling its sharp edges dig deeper into his palm. Blood welled up around the brass, dark and real, and his own. Where it dropped onto the moss, the emerald growth withered and blackened, creating spreading patches of death in the house's living heart. "I understand now," Walter said, pushing himself to his feet despite the agony in his joints. "It's not about perfection. It never was." The house responded by flooding his mind with visions, not of what could have been, but of what still might be if he would only surrender. He saw himself young again, his hands steady and sure as they crafted timepieces of impossible beauty. He saw a woman whose face he couldn't quite remember loving him with desperate devotion. He saw children who called him grandfather, their laughter echoing through rooms that sparkled with warmth and joy. But underneath each vision, Walter now perceived the terrible sameness, the mechanical repetition that robbed even joy of meaning. The woman's love was programmed. The children's laughter played on an endless loop. The timepieces he crafted dissolved into green mist the moment he looked away. It was paradise as conceived by something that had never been truly alive, perfect and meaningless as a broken clock that showed the right time twice a day. "You don't understand," Thomas pleaded, his form becoming more translucent with each passing second. "Without the dreams, without the consciousness to feed on, we all die. Not just the house, everyone it's preserved. Decades of lives, decades of love and happiness." "Decades of lies," Walter interrupted, taking a step toward the nearest cocoon. Inside, he could see a middle-aged woman, her face peaceful in artificial slumber. How long has she been dreaming of a life that isn't hers? Thomas tried to block his path, but his substance was failing, his connection to the house's power severing as Walter's resistance grew stronger. 20 years, maybe more. "But she's happy, Walter. She has everything she ever wanted. She has nothing." Walter pressed his bleeding palm against the cocoon's membrane. Where his blood touched it, cracks appeared, spreading outward like fractures in glass. She gave up her right to choose what happiness means. The house shuddered again, and Walter felt its desperation washing over him in waves. The moss began retreating from the walls, revealing bare stone and earth that hadn't seen light in over a century. Whatever force had animated this place was dying, its grip on the preserved consciousness growing weaker with each moment. Through the dissolution, Walter finally saw the truth that had taken him 73 years to understand. He had spent his entire life measuring himself against imagined standards, mourning the family he'd never had, the success he'd never achieved, the love he'd never found. But those absences didn't diminish the reality of what he had accomplished, the beauty he'd created with his hands, the problems he'd solved through patience and skill, the quiet dignity with which he'd faced each disappointment. The house had offered him everything he thought he wanted, but it couldn't give him the one thing that mattered most: the weight of authentic choice, the bitter satisfaction of a life lived on his own terms. Thomas made one final attempt to stop him, lunging forward with the last of his fading strength. But he passed through Walter like smoke, his form dissolving entirely as the house's power collapsed. For just an instant, Walter glimpsed the man Thomas had truly been, frightened, grieving, but fundamentally human in ways the Moss Dream version had never been. "I'm sorry," Walter whispered to the empty air where Thomas had stood. "But this isn't living. This is just elaborate dying." The cocoons were cracking now, their occupants beginning to stir as the house's hold on them weakened. Some would wake to find decades had passed, their bodies preserved but their true lives stolen. Others might never wake at all, too deeply integrated into the house's consciousness to exist independently. Walter turned toward what he hoped was the way out, the broken gear wheel still clutched in his bloodied fist. The moss continued its retreat, leaving behind a network of natural caves that had probably existed long before the house above. Whatever this place had been originally, a sanctuary, a trap, or simply an accident of geography and supernatural circumstance, it was returning to ordinary earth and stone. The illusions were failing. Soon there would be nothing left but an old man and an empty house, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Walter began to climb toward the surface, toward whatever remained of his real life. The climb back to the surface felt endless. Walter's arthritic joints screamed with each step upward through the crumbling cave system, but the pain grounded him in reality in ways the house's perfect comfort never could. The broken gear wheel remained clutched in his bleeding fist, a talisman of authentic failure that had somehow become more precious than any imagined success. Behind him, he could hear the other captives stirring. A woman's voice, confused and frightened, called out in the darkness, "Where am I? What year is it?" Her words echoed off stone walls that no longer pulsed with unnatural life. Walter wanted to help her, to guide the others to safety, but he barely had strength left for his own escape. When he finally emerged into the Victorian cottage's main floor, the transformation was complete. Gone were the warm, inviting rooms filled with impossible memories. The walls had returned to their natural state, peeling wallpaper, water damage, the accumulated decay of 30 abandoned years. Dust motes danced in shafts of genuine sunlight streaming through broken windows, and Walter felt something loosen in his chest at the sight. This was real. Broken, disappointing, achingly empty, but real. He made his way to the kitchen, where his mother's fresh bread had waited just hours before. The table was bare now except for a layer of grime and the scattered droppings of mice who had made this place their honest home. Walter ran his fingers across the scarred wood surface and felt a smile tug at his lips. Even this abandonment was more beautiful than the house's manufactured warmth. But as he stood there, something unexpected happened. The memories of his real parents began to surface, not the idealized versions the house had conjured, but the complicated, flawed people who had actually raised him. His mother's tendency to worry, the way she'd fretted over every small decision until she drove herself to distraction. His father's quiet disappointment when Walter had chosen clockmaking over the accounting career he'd planned for his son. They had loved him, Walter realized, imperfectly, conditionally, within the limits of their own understanding, but they had loved him. The house had shown him perfect parents who existed only to adore him, but his real parents had been far more valuable. They had been human. The revelation brought unexpected strength. Walter straightened his shoulders and looked around the ruined kitchen with new eyes. Yes, he was alone. Yes, he was poor and old and facing an uncertain future. But he was also free. free to choose what came next, free to find meaning in whatever time remained to him, free to be disappointed or surprised, or simply present in whatever ordinary moments awaited. Through the broken window, he caught sight of movement in the overgrown garden. The first of the freed captives was emerging from a hidden entrance among the moss-covered foundation stones. It was the woman whose voice he'd heard below, middle-aged, disoriented, but alive. She stumbled into the afternoon sunlight like someone emerging from a decades-long coma, which, Walter supposed, she essentially was. Others followed. An elderly man in clothes from the 1990s, blinking owlishly at a world that had moved on without him. A young woman whose vintage dress suggested she'd been trapped since the 1960s, now faced with a reality where everything she'd known had vanished. Not all of them would survive this transition, Walter knew. Some minds weren't strong enough to process the magnitude of what they'd lost. But some would adapt. They would grieve for their stolen years, then find ways to build new lives from whatever remained. They would choose reality over illusion, no matter how painful that choice might be. In their courage, Walter found his own resolve crystallizing into something harder than hope: determination. He had resources the house's fantasy had never acknowledged. His hands might be arthritic, but they still held decades of accumulated skill. His body might be failing, but his mind remained sharp. His pension might be gone, but he still possessed the fundamental human ability to adapt, to find purpose in unexpected places. Moving to the front window, Walter looked out at the fog-shrouded hills of Northern California and began to plan. The other survivors would need help adjusting to decades of change: technology, society, the simple mechanics of modern life. Perhaps there was work to be done there, guidance to offer from someone who understood what they'd lost. The irony wasn't lost on him. The house had shown him a fantasy where he guided and taught others, where his knowledge mattered. But here in reality, that possibility still existed, not as a perfect illusion but as a choice he could make, a life he could build through effort and intention. Walter pocketed the broken gear wheel and walked toward the front door. The moss had retreated completely now, revealing the cottage's original architecture, weathered but honest, damaged but salvageable. Like everything else worth preserving. He had work to do, people to help, a real life to construct from the ruins of his manufactured dreams. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be his. The choice felt like coming home. Walter stepped onto the cottage's front porch, feeling the weathered boards sag beneath his weight. The sensation was profoundly satisfying after the house's supernatural solidity. Every creak and groan spoke of genuine age, honest decay, the beautiful imperfection of time's passage. The broken gear wheel pressed against his palm through his pocket, its sharp edges a constant reminder of what was real. The woman from the garden approached hesitantly, shielding her eyes against sunlight that must have felt alien after decades underground. Up close, Walter could see the disorientation in her features, the particular bewilderment of someone whose last clear memory belonged to a different century. She couldn't be more than 50, but her clothes suggested she'd been trapped since the early 2000s. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a tremor of controlled panic. "I think I'm lost. Could you tell me what year it is?" Walter studied her face, seeing his own confusion reflected there. 2024, he said gently. "How long do you think you've been away?" Her composure cracked slightly. "I remember driving up here for a real estate showing. The cottage was for sale, and I was thinking about buying it as a weekend retreat." She laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. "That was in 2003. 21 years. Walter felt the weight of that stolen time like a physical blow. This woman had lost careers, relationships, the chance to age gracefully into whatever life she might have built. The house had consumed her prime years, leaving her stranded in a world that had moved on without her. "I'm Walter Crane," he said, extending his hand. "I think we need to get you some help. Sarah Chen." Her handshake was firm despite her obvious distress. "Are there others? I remember seeing cocoons, people suspended in—" She shuddered, unable to finish the sentence. More figures were emerging from the garden. 7 so far, maybe 8. Each carried the same shell-shocked expression, the particular hollow-eyed look of people processing an impossible loss. Walter watched them stumble into the late afternoon light and felt the magnitude of his responsibility settling around his shoulders like a familiar weight. This was the final confrontation he hadn't expected, not with the house, which was already dying, but with the consequences of his choice. These people needed him to be exactly what the house had fantasized: a guide, a teacher, someone who could help them navigate a world that had fundamentally changed while they dreamed. The irony was almost amusing. The house's manipulation had been based on a truth it couldn't understand. Walter did have value to offer, skills that mattered. "We need to call for help," he told Sarah. "Emergency services, missing persons databases. Some of these people have families who've been searching for decades." Sarah pulled a phone from her purse, a device that looked impossibly primitive by current standards. She stared at its blank screen with the expression of someone holding a relic from a lost civilization. "I don't suppose this will work anymore." "We'll figure it out," Walter said, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "One step at a time." The elderly man from the 1990s had wandered to the edge of the property, staring down at the winding road with profound confusion. The world beyond would be even more disorienting. Smartphones, social media, the accumulated changes of 3 decades compressed into a single moment of awakening. Some of them wouldn't be able to process it. Some might choose to retreat into madness rather than face what they'd lost. But Walter had learned something in the house's depths that the entity itself had never understood. Human beings were extraordinarily resilient, capable of adapting to losses that should have been devastating. They could build new meanings from the rubble of shattered expectations, find purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. The proof stood all around him, people who had been given every reason to surrender, now blinking in honest sunlight and choosing to continue. Walter pulled out his own phone, grateful for the solid weight of modern technology. The screen showed no signal. They were too deep in the hills, but he knew the road led eventually to civilization, to resources and help, and the complicated machinery of a world that specialized in piecing lives back together. "Listen," he called to the other survivors, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had chosen reality over paradise. "We're going to walk down to where we can get help. It's going to be hard. The world has changed more than you can imagine, but we'll face it together, and we'll figure it out as we go." The young woman from the 1960s looked up at him with something like hope. "You're not one of us, are you? You chose to leave." Walter nodded, feeling the broken gear wheel's edges through his pocket. "I chose this. The uncertainty, the pain, the possibility of failure. I chose all of it." He looked back at the cottage one last time. Already it seemed smaller, more ordinary. Just an abandoned house where tragedy had once lived. Tomorrow, officials would come to investigate. The property would be sealed, studied, eventually demolished. The house's supernatural hunger had died with its illusions, leaving only questions that would never be fully answered. But the people were real. Their need was real. And Walter Crane, 73 years old and finally awake, had real work to do. He began walking toward the road, leading them home. The walk down the hillside should have been a simple descent toward civilization. Instead, it became something else entirely. A journey that seemed to stretch far longer than the actual distance, as if the very landscape was testing Walter's resolve one final time. The fog rolled in as they descended, thick and unnatural, carrying whispers that made the other survivors clutch closer together. Walter recognized the sensation immediately. The house wasn't finished with them. Even dying, it was gathering what remained of its power for one last attempt to reclaim what it had lost. "Keep moving," he called back to the group. But his own feet felt increasingly heavy with each step. The broken gear wheel in his pocket had grown warm, almost burning against his palm. When he pulled it out, the metal surface was glowing with a faint green light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Sarah stumbled beside him, her face blank with confusion. "Walter, I think we're walking in circles. I swear I've seen that same twisted tree 3 times now." She was right. The path that had seemed so straightforward was now a maze that folded back on itself. The house was using its final reserves to trap them in a pocket of distorted space. one last desperate attempt to preserve its collection of stolen lives. Walter could feel the entity's hunger pressing against his mind, weakened but not yet defeated. "It's fighting back," he said, more to himself than the others. "It won't let us go that easily." The fog thickened until they could barely see 10 feet ahead. The other survivors began to panic, voices calling out in fear, footsteps scattering in different directions. Walter realized with growing dread that they were being separated, picked off one by one to be drawn back into the house's influence. This was the moment everything had been building toward. Not the confrontation in the caves below, but this, the final test of his commitment to reality. The house was offering him a choice: abandon the others and escape alone, or stay and fight for their freedom with tools he barely understood. Walter closed his eyes and felt for the truth beneath the illusion. His hands, arthritic and pain-racked, still remembered 40 years of precise work. His mind, clouded with age and disappointment, still held the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent solving mechanical puzzles. The house had shown him fantasies of mastery, but the real skills, imperfect, limited, entirely human, had been his all along. He knelt and pressed the glowing gear wheel against the earth. Where it touched, cracks appeared in the fog itself, revealing glimpses of the real world beyond. The house's power was mechanical at its core, Walter realized, a vast supernatural clockwork that had been running on stolen time for over a century. And like any mechanism, it had weak points, places where the right pressure could cause the entire system to fail. "Everyone follow my voice," he shouted into the confusion. "The fog isn't real. It's just another dream trying to take hold." But even as he spoke, Walter felt the house's final gambit beginning. The fog swirled around him, and suddenly he was elsewhere, standing in a sunlit workshop filled with masterpiece timepieces he had never created. His hands were young and steady, his back straight and strong. At his workbench sat the greatest clock he had ever imagined, a device that could literally turn back time, undo every mistake, restore every lost possibility. "You understand now," came a voice that was no longer Thomas but something far older. "You don't have to save them. You can save yourself. Use the clock, Walter. Go back to any moment you choose. Be young again. Make different choices. Have the life you always deserved." The temptation was overwhelming. Walter's fingers moved toward the clock's mechanism, knowing exactly how its gears would feel beneath his touch. He could return to his 20s, pursue the woman he'd been too shy to approach. He could choose a different career, one that brought wealth and recognition. He could have children, grandchildren, a legacy that would outlast his mortal frame. But then he heard Sarah's voice, distant and afraid, calling his name in the fog. She was real. Her fear was real. The decades she had lost were real, and no amount of supernatural clockwork could give them back to her. Walter's hands stilled above the impossible timepiece. "No," he said quietly. "That's not how time works. The past is gone, and trying to reclaim it just steals the future from someone else." He stepped back from the workbench, and the workshop began to dissolve around him. The house's voice rose to a shriek of frustrated rage, but Walter could hear the weakness beneath it now, the sound of an ancient mechanism finally breaking down. The fog cleared like a curtain being pulled aside, revealing his fellow survivors standing exactly where he had left them on the hillside path. The real path, leading down toward the valley where distant lights promised help and human connection, and all the messy complications of authentic life. Walter pocketed the now dark gear wheel and began walking again, leading them toward whatever uncertain future awaited below. But the house wasn't finished with him yet. The moment Walter's foot touched the next stone of the hillside path, reality shattered like glass around them. The other survivors vanished into wisps of fog, their terrified voices echoing from impossible distances. The path beneath his feet crumbled away, leaving him suspended in a void that pulsed with malevolent intelligence. "You think you've won?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, no longer pretending to be Thomas or his parents or anyone human. It was pure hunger-given voice, ancient and vast and utterly alien. "You understand nothing of what you're destroying." Walter found himself standing in the cottage's front parlor again, but wrong. The walls breathed like living tissue, the floorboards bled moss and shadow, and every surface writhed with patterns that hurt to look at directly. This wasn't the house's seductive fantasy. This was its true face, the predatory entity that had worn the cottage like a mask for over a century. "I am older than your civilization," the voice continued, and now Walter could see its source, a massive clockwork heart embedded in the wall where the fireplace should have been. Gears the size of wagon wheels turned with agonizing slowness, each tick marking another stolen year, another consumed life. "I have preserved perfection while your world drowns in meaningless change. I have given meaning to the meaningless, purpose to the purposeless, and you would unmake all of that for what? The chance to die forgotten and alone." The clockwork heart's rhythm was hypnotic, each movement accompanied by whispers of all the lives it had absorbed. Walter heard the voices of hundreds of victims spanning decades, their dreams, their regrets, their final moments of choosing beautiful lies over harsh truths. The weight of that accumulated suffering pressed against his mind like a physical force. "Look at what I offered you," the entity snarled, and the walls exploded with visions. Walter saw himself as a master craftsman, wealthy and respected. He saw the family he'd never had, the love he'd never found, the recognition he'd always craved. "Perfect happiness was yours. All you had to do was let me feed on one more generation of lost souls." Was that so terrible a price? Walter's arthritic hands were shaking, but he forced himself to approach the clockwork heart. Up close, he could see the truth of its construction. Each gear was made from compressed time itself, crystallized moments of stolen possibility. The entity didn't just feed on its victims, it transformed their very existence into the mechanism of its own survival. "It was never real," Walter said, his voice barely audible over the mechanical heartbeat. The happiness, the perfection, the love, none of it meant anything because none of it was chosen. You don't preserve lives. You stuff them and mount them like trophies. The entity's rage erupted around him. The walls began to collapse inward, reality folding like origami as the house's fundamental structure unraveled. But Walter had spent 40 years studying clockwork, understanding how the smallest component could bring down the largest machine. He knew exactly which gear to target. The broken gear wheel in his pocket had become scalding hot, but Walter forced himself to grasp it anyway. His palm blistered against the metal as he raised it toward the clockwork heart. The entity's voice rose to an inhuman shriek of recognition. This wasn't just any gear, but a piece of its own mechanism, broken free by Walter's rejection of its gifts. "Without me, they have nothing," the entity screamed. "Sarah Chen will never recover the 21 years she lost. The others will find a world that has no place for them. You condemn them to suffer for your pride." For a moment, Walter's hand hesitated. The entity was right about the suffering that awaited the survivors. The real world would be cruel to them, offering no easy answers or perfect resolutions. Some would never fully adjust. Some might not survive the transition at all. By destroying the house, Walter was choosing their pain over their preservation. But then he remembered Sarah's voice in the fog, afraid but real, calling his name not because she needed him to save her, but because she needed to know she wasn't alone. That was the difference the entity couldn't understand. Real suffering shared was infinitely more valuable than perfect happiness experienced in isolation. Walter drove the broken gear into the heart of the mechanism. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The clockwork heart seized with a sound like the world's largest clock striking midnight, then began to tear itself apart. Gears shattered, springs snapped, and centuries of stolen time erupted outward in an explosion of pure possibility. Walter felt the house's death scream in his bones as reality reasserted itself with violent finality. When the chaos subsided, he was lying on his back in the cottage's actual parlor, dusty, abandoned, heartbreakingly normal. Through the broken windows he could hear voices calling his name, real voices, belonging to real people who had chosen to face an uncertain future together. Walter smiled and closed his eyes, feeling the weight of authentic exhaustion settle into his bones. The confrontation was over. The choice was made. Walter lay still for a long moment, listening to the voices calling his name from outside the cottage. Sarah's voice was among them, real and afraid but undeniably present. They had all made it through. But as he tried to sit up, a sharp pain lanced through his chest, and he tasted copper on his tongue. The broken gear wheel had fallen from his hand, its metal surface now cold and ordinary. But where it had burned his palm, Walter saw something that made his heart sink. The skin wasn't merely blistered, it was marked with the same intricate clockwork patterns he'd seen on the entity's victims, spreading slowly up his wrist like a tattoo of tarnished silver. The house's final price was becoming clear. Walter managed to push himself upright, his breath coming in short gasps. Each inhale felt like drawing air through broken glass. The entity hadn't died cleanly. It had taken something vital from him as it collapsed, stealing years from his life to fuel its own destruction. He could feel time bleeding out of him with each heartbeat, the clockwork poison racing through his veins. "Walter!" Sarah's voice was closer now, just outside the moss-covered door. "Are you in there?" "I'm here," he called back, surprised by how weak his voice sounded. "I'm coming out." But when he tried to stand, his legs buckled. The arthritis that had ended his career felt like fire in his joints now, accelerated and intensified. His reflection in a broken mirror showed what the entity had taken. His hair had gone completely white, his face deeply lined, his eyes clouded with the particular exhaustion of someone whose body was consuming itself. The sacrifice wasn't metaphorical. By destroying the house, Walter had paid with the only currency the entity understood, time itself. Years of his remaining life, already precious few at 73, had been drained away to power the clockwork heart's death throes. He might have days left, or hours, or minutes. There was no way to know. Through the cottage windows, he could see the other survivors gathered in the overgrown garden. The elderly man from the 1990s was supporting the young woman from the 1960s, both of them moving with the careful steps of people still adjusting to physical reality. Sarah stood apart, checking an old cell phone with growing frustration. They looked lost, vulnerable, overwhelmed by their transition back to a world that had moved on without them. They needed guidance. They needed someone who understood both the trauma they'd experienced and the harsh realities they now faced. They needed exactly what the house had always claimed Walter could be: a teacher, a guide, a steady hand to help them navigate their new circumstances. He had become that person by choosing to destroy the very thing that had offered to make him perfect. Walter forced himself to his feet, ignoring the way his vision grayed at the edges. He had work to do, and whatever time the entity had left him needed to be spent wisely. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd rejected the house's gift of eternal life in a perfect dream, only to discover that his real life's greatest purpose would unfold in its final hours. He made his way to the door, each step an act of will against the clockwork poison coursing through his system. His hands, when he gripped the doorframe, left faint silver marks on the wood, the same marks he'd seen in the entity's lair, the signature of absorbed time. The afternoon light was blinding after the cottage's supernatural gloom, but Walter pushed through it to reach the survivors. Sarah looked up as he approached, relief flooding her features before being replaced by concern. "Walter, you look—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Like I'm dying," he completed gently. "Because I am. The house took its payment for letting you all go." The words should have been devastating, but Walter felt only a strange peace. He thought of all the perfect lives the entity had offered him, the success, the love, the recognition, and realized none of them would have meant as much as this moment. Standing in honest sunlight with people who had chosen reality over fantasy, preparing to spend his final hours in genuine service rather than artificial fulfillment. "How long?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Walter looked down at his hands, where the silver patterns were spreading like frost on glass. Not long, but long enough. He pulled out his cell phone, grateful to see 2 bars of signal strength. Emergency services first, then missing persons databases, then the complex work of helping each survivor navigate reintegration into a world that had fundamentally changed. It would be Walter's masterpiece, not a perfect clock that could turn back time, but a bridge that helped real people step from loss into possibility. The house's moss-covered walls were already beginning to crumble behind them. its supernatural preservation finally failing. But the people were real, their needs were real, and Walter Crane had real work to do with whatever time remained. He began making calls, leading them toward home. The first call connected on the third ring. 911, what's your emergency? Walter's voice was steady, despite the silver patterns now spreading past his elbows. I'm calling from the old Crane property on Ridge Road, about 8 miles north of Mendocino. I have 5 people here who need immediate medical attention and assistance with missing persons reports dating back decades. A pause. Sir, did you say decades? That's correct. The earliest case is from 1963. Walter looked at the young woman who was staring at Sarah's cell phone with the wonder of someone seeing magic. I'll explain everything when your people arrive. While they waited, Walter worked methodically through each survivor's story. Margaret Chen, Sarah's grandmother, though she appeared younger than her granddaughter now, had vanished while hiking in 1963. The missing persons report would be archived, filed under cold cases. Robert Martinez had disappeared in 1978, leaving behind a wife and 2 children who would now be older than he was. Each story was a puzzle of broken timelines and impossible biology that would require careful handling. The world's going to be very different, Walter told them, settling carefully onto a moss-covered stone bench that was already crumbling as the house's influence faded. Technology, politics, culture, everything has changed. But people are still people. They still need connection, still need purpose. Sarah sat beside him, her eyes never leaving the silver patterns that were now visible on his neck. There has to be something we can do, some way to stop this. Walter shook his head gently. The entity fed on stolen time for over a century. When it died, all that accumulated temporal energy had to go somewhere. I chose to let it take what remained of mine rather than pull you all back down with it. He managed a smile. It's a fair trade. The distant sound of sirens began echoing through the hills. Walter used the time to coach each survivor on what to say, how to present their impossible circumstances in ways that might be believed. Missing persons cases, unexplained amnesia, anything that sounded more plausible than supernatural imprisonment. The truth would come out eventually, but only after they were safe. Margaret was struggling with English. 60 years of isolation had left her trapped in the language patterns of 1963, confused by modern slang and references. Walter found himself drawing on patience he didn't know he possessed, gently guiding her through basic phrases while explaining concepts that hadn't existed when she disappeared. Computers, he said, showing her Sarah's phone. Like televisions, but they connect people across vast distances instantly. They're everywhere now. In homes, pockets, cars. The silver patterns reached his collarbone. Walter could feel his heartbeat becoming irregular, his breathing increasingly labored. But there was still work to do. Robert needed help understanding that his children were now in their 50s, grandparents themselves. The woman from the 1980s, Jennifer, was panicking about HIV awareness and nuclear war, fears that had defined her era. Each needed different reassurances, different bridges between their lost time and the present reality. The first emergency vehicle appeared on the winding road below, followed by 2 more. Walter felt a deep satisfaction as he watched them approach. Real help, provided by real people who would do their imperfect best to address an impossible situation. It wasn't the clean, magical solution the house would have offered, but it was authentic. Walter, Sarah's voice was tight with emotion. I need you to know what you did in there, choosing us over yourself. I didn't choose you over myself, Walter interrupted gently. I chose reality over fantasy, for all of us. The silver patterns were spreading across his chest now, and each breath was an effort. The house offered me everything I thought I wanted, but it would have been built on your suffering. That's not happiness, that's just elaborate selfishness. The paramedics were hiking up the overgrown path now, medical bags in hand, radios crackling with coordinated responses. Walter could see the confusion on their faces as they took in the scene. 5 people of varying ages, apparently healthy but claiming impossible histories, gathered around a collapsing Victorian cottage that looked like something from a fairy tale. But they came anyway. They would do their jobs, ask their questions, provide their help, because that's what people did when faced with others in need. It wasn't perfect and it wouldn't solve everything, but it was real in a way the house's gifts never could have been. Walter closed his eyes and felt the afternoon sun on his face, genuine warmth from an authentic star. Around him, he could hear the careful, professional voices of the emergency responders beginning their work. Sarah was explaining their situation in the careful phrases he'd taught her. The other survivors were following his coaching, presenting their stories in ways that might actually result in help rather than psychiatric evaluation. His masterpiece was taking shape, not a perfect mechanism, but a bridge between impossible circumstances and ordinary human compassion. It would be enough. It would have to be enough. The silver patterns reached his heart, and Walter Crane smiled. The silver patterns completed their journey across Walter's chest, and the world went quiet. For a moment that stretched like pulled taffy, Walter existed in the space between heartbeats. He could see everything with crystalline clarity, Sarah's tears catching the afternoon light, Margaret clutching a paramedic's hand as she tried to explain in broken English about a world that no longer existed, Robert staring at the smartphone like it might hold answers to decades of lost time. The cottage behind them had finished its collapse, leaving only ordinary rubble covered in ordinary moss. Then his heart stuttered back to life, weak but persistent. The silver patterns weren't spreading anymore. They'd stopped just short of the vital organs that would have meant instant death. Walter gasped, tasting copper and ozone, and realized the entity's final cruelty. It had taken exactly enough to ensure he would live, but only barely. Only long enough to fully understand what he'd lost. "Sir, please don't move." A young paramedic knelt beside him, professional calm masking obvious confusion. "We're going to get you to the hospital." The hospital. Walter almost laughed at the beautiful normalcy of it. No magical healing, no supernatural intervention, just ordinary people with ordinary skills trying their imperfect best to help. The paramedic's hands were gentle as she checked his pulse, her radio crackling with the mundane poetry of emergency medicine, blood pressure dropping, pulse thready, patient responsive but disoriented. "Walter, stay with me." Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You don't get to disappear now, not after everything." The ambulance ride down the winding mountain road was a blur of concerned faces and beeping monitors. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time he woke, Sarah was there. She'd somehow convinced the paramedics to let her ride along, probably by claiming to be family. The lie felt more true than most facts. At the hospital, Walter became a medical mystery. The silver patterns on his skin didn't match any known condition, his blood work showed impossible readings, and his cellular structure appeared to be aging in real time under microscopic examination. But Dr. Elena Vasquez, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, treated him with the same careful attention she gave every patient. "I don't know what happened to you up there," she said during one of Walter's clearer moments, "but your body is showing signs of extreme temporal displacement. That shouldn't be medically possible, but here we are." She adjusted his fore-drip with practiced efficiency. "We're going to stabilize you as best we can." Over the following days, Walter watched the impossible logistics of reintegration unfold around him. Social workers appeared to help the survivors navigate a world that had moved on without them. Margaret was the greatest challenge, a woman in her 20s who was legally 84, with no modern identification or records of existence. But slowly, patiently, the system adapted. Exceptions were made, paperwork was filed, and gradually each survivor found a foothold in reality. Sarah became their unofficial coordinator, using skills Walter hadn't known she possessed. She set up a support group for temporal displacement survivors. They couldn't call it that officially, but everyone involved understood. She found Margaret a small apartment near Chinatown, where the elderly woman could hear familiar dialects while learning to navigate smartphones and credit cards. She helped Robert contact his children, now grown with children of their own, facilitating reunions that were awkward and painful and absolutely real. "You taught me this," Sarah told Walter during one of her daily visits. She was different now, more focused, more purposeful. The aimless grief that had defined her before the house was gone, replaced by a clear understanding of her own capabilities, how to build bridges between impossible circumstances and ordinary compassion. Walter's recovery was slow and incomplete. The silver patterns had left him with permanent nerve damage, his arthritis was worse than ever, and his life expectancy had been cut dramatically short. But he was alive, genuinely alive in a way he'd never been in the house's perfect rooms. His small hospital room was cramped and sterile. The food was terrible, and the nights were long and often painful. It was wonderful. 3 months after their escape, Walter was finally discharged to a small assisted living facility, not because he needed the medical care, but because Sarah had specifically chosen one where several staff members spoke Mandarin. Margaret had taken a job there helping other elderly Chinese immigrants adjust to American healthcare systems. The young woman who had been frozen in 1963 was now teaching others how to navigate the complexities of modern life. On his first evening there, Walter sat in the common room, watching Margaret patiently explain Medicare benefits to a confused recent immigrant. Sarah was visiting Robert's expanded family, helping them all understand the strange miracle of his return. Jennifer was taking college courses, decades delayed but finally pursuing the degree she'd been working toward when the house took her. They were all struggling. None of their lives were perfect, and the real world continued to be harsh and unforgiving. But they were struggling together, building something genuine from the wreckage of their stolen time. Walter smiled and settled deeper into his chair, feeling authentic exhaustion in his bones. He was exactly where he belonged. The new beginning. 6 months later, Walter woke to the sound of laughter drifting through his window. Real laughter, unpolished and imperfect, coming from the facility's garden where Margaret was teaching Tai Chi to a group of residents. Her movements were careful, accommodating bodies that had lived full lives and bore the beautiful scars of authentic experience. The early morning light caught the silver thread still visible on Walter's hands as he reached for his reading glasses, a daily reminder of the price paid for choosing reality over illusion. His small room had become a hub of quiet activity. Sarah visited twice weekly, bringing updates on the others and occasionally new people who needed help navigating impossible circumstances. The network had grown organically. Someone knew someone who'd experienced something that couldn't quite be explained. And somehow they all found their way to Walter's door, not seeking magical solutions, but simply needing someone who understood that the world was stranger than most people imagined, and that surviving strangeness required community. This morning brought Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had returned from a fishing trip with memories of decades that had never happened, and young David Chen, Margaret's great-nephew, who was writing a sociology thesis on temporal displacement support networks. Walter listened to their stories with the patience he'd cultivated in his final months, offering not answers, but something more valuable, witness. "The hardest part," Mrs. Patterson was saying, "is that everyone expects me to just be grateful he's back. And I am, but he's not the same person. 60 years of experiences that never happened. How do we bridge that?" Walter nodded, understanding the weight of impossible adjustments. "Start small," he suggested. "Find one thing that's still the same between you. Build from there." It was advice born from watching Robert slowly reconnect with children who were now older than him, learning to be a grandfather to people who remembered him as a young father. The afternoon brought Walter's favorite part of the week, story time in the children's ward. Sarah had discovered his gift for spinning tales that helped young patients process difficult realities, and he'd become a regular volunteer. Today, he sat surrounded by kids receiving treatment for various conditions, their faces turned toward him with the focused attention children reserved for truths disguised as fairy tales. "Once upon a time," Walter began, "there was a clockmaker who thought he knew how time was supposed to work. He believed broken things should be fixed to look exactly like they did before they broke. But he learned something important. Sometimes the most beautiful clocks are the ones that keep their scratches and run a little slow." 8-year-old Emma, whose leukemia had been declared in remission the previous week, raised her hand. "Is this about how my hair grew back different?" Walter smiled. "What do you think?" "I think maybe different isn't always bad," she said, touching the soft curls that had replaced her straight hair. Mom cries happy tears when she looks at it. After the children's ward, Walter made his way slowly to the facility's workshop, a converted storage room that had become his latest masterpiece. Here he taught basic repair skills to residents and visitors alike, showing them how to fix small things with patience rather than perfection. Margaret had contributed a table where she demonstrated traditional Chinese knots. Robert, who visited monthly, had set up a corner for basic automotive maintenance. Jennifer led computer literacy classes on Tuesday evenings. It wasn't the grand clockmaking workshop the house had offered him, where his arthritic hands would have been magically restored, and his creations would have achieved impossible precision. Instead, it was a space where people with real limitations worked together to accomplish small, meaningful repairs. Wobbly chairs that could hold weight again. Watches that kept time well enough to matter. Torn photographs carefully taped back together, still damaged but preserved. Walter settled at his workbench, where a steady stream of items waited for attention. Today's project was a jewelry box that had belonged to Mrs. Chen in the memory care unit, its melody broken, its tiny dancer frozen mid-spin. His silver-marked fingers moved carefully over the delicate mechanism, understanding now that the goal wasn't to make it perfect, but to make it work well enough to bring joy. As he worked, Sarah arrived with her usual Tuesday evening update. She'd started a non-profit organization to help people navigate unexplained circumstances, not advertising supernatural solutions, but offering practical support for those whose lives had taken impossible turns. The house on Ridge Road had left a legacy after all, though nothing like what the entity had intended. 3 new referrals this week, Sarah reported, settling into the chair beside his workbench. A woman whose daughter returned from a hiking trip with no memory of the last 5 years, a man whose deceased wife's garden keeps blooming out of season, and someone whose grandmother claims to remember conversations with relatives who died before she was born. Walter nodded, his attention split between Sarah's words and the tiny gears under his magnifying glass. Each case was a puzzle requiring patience, creativity, and the understanding that some things couldn't be fully explained, only lived through with support. The jewelry box's mechanism suddenly clicked into place. Walter wound the key carefully, and the tiny dancer began to turn again, the melody soft and slightly off-key but undeniably beautiful. Mrs. Chen would smile tomorrow when he brought it to her room, even if she didn't remember asking him to fix it. As evening approached, Walter made his way to the garden where several residents were tending vegetables with the focused attention of people who understood the miracle of ordinary growth. Margaret was there, showing another recent immigrant how to identify herbs by touch, their conversation a mixture of Mandarin and careful English. The garden was imperfect. Some plants struggled, others grew in unexpected directions, and the weather remained beyond their control. But it was real in a way the house's magical preservation never could have been. Each tomato was earned through actual effort. Each flower bloomed according to natural cycles rather than artificial perfection. Walter sat on a simple wooden bench, one he'd repaired himself, its joints still slightly loose but functional, and watched the sun set over the valley. His body ached with authentic pain, his breathing was labored, and he could feel the silver pattern's lasting effects in every heartbeat. According to his doctors, he had months left rather than years. But as he sat there, surrounded by the gentle sounds of real people living imperfect lives, Walter felt a satisfaction deeper than anything the house's perfect rooms had offered. He had become what he'd always had the potential to be, not a master craftsman whose work would outlast centuries, but a teacher who helped others learn that broken things could still be beautiful, that struggling together was better than perfection alone. Sarah joined him on the bench, carrying 2 cups of tea from the facility's kitchen, terrible institutional tea that somehow tasted perfect in the context of genuine companionship. "Any regrets?" she asked, a question that had become their evening ritual. Walter considered this, watching Margaret demonstrate proper pruning technique to a group of residents who hung on her every word. Jennifer was visible through the classroom window, helping an elderly man navigate email for the first time. Robert's truck was pulling into the parking lot for his monthly visit, his grown children and their families crowding out behind him. All of them were struggling with real problems in an imperfect world. All of them were building something meaningful from the pieces of their interrupted lives. All of them had chosen reality over the house's beautiful lies, and that choice had transformed them into exactly who they needed to become. "No regrets," Walter said finally, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest like a well-fitted gear finding its proper place. "This is exactly where I belong." The last light faded from the sky, and Walter Crane sat in genuine darkness surrounded by authentic stars, knowing that his final masterpiece wasn't a clock that could turn back time, but a community that helped people move forward together. It was imperfect and fragile and absolutely real. It was enough. It was everything.